Our next witness is the Director of the National Security Archive at George Washington University, Professor Thomas Blanton. In the year 2000, the archive won the George Polk Award for, quote, piercing self-serving veils of government secrecy, guiding journalists in search of the truth and informing us all. He's also the founding editorial board member of freedominfo.org, a network of international freedom of information advocates. I read your prepared statement with great enthusiasm, and we're happy to have you here today.
Mr. Chairman, it's a great honor for me and Judge Gomert, and also to be in the middle of this extraordinary high-level tutorial in the Espionage Act and the Constitution. I feel like a grad student again, and it's a joy, actually. I also wanted to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for resurrecting my graveyard quote, that we have low fences around vast prairies of government secrets where we really need tall fences around small graveyards of the real secrets. And that's a core point I want to come back to today. I really have 3 points. One of them is the government always overreacts to leaks, always. And all you have to do is say the phrase Watergate plumbers, and you know what I'm talking about. Back then, they were discussing firebombing the Brookings Institution on the chance there might still be a copy of the Pentagon Papers in there. Today, you're having debates on Fox News. Let's do some targeted assassination attempts on Julian Assange. Well, I got to say, G. Gordon Liddy would be right at home. And both is absurd. And the overreaction the government typically does is not to kill anybody or firebomb something, but to go right to the second major point I want to make today. They're going to classify more information. What I'm worried about most is the backlash. I mean, in my prepared statement, I've got multiple examples of all the estimates, and they range from 50% to 90% of what the problem of overclassification really amounts to. Governor Tom Kaine, head of the 9/11 Commission, after looking at all the al-Qaeda intelligence that we gathered before 9/11, said, you know, 75% of what I saw that was classified should not have been. And the commission said we not only needed to do information sharing between the agencies, we had to do information sharing with the American people, because that's the only way we could really protect ourselves. What a great lesson that is. And the system is so overwhelmed with the secrets that we can no longer really protect the real ones, and we can't let out the ones that would actually keep us all safer. And I think it's a mistake to try to see this as a balancing test. It's not a balance between openness and security. The findings of the 9/11 Commission were that more openness would have made us more secure. That's what you do in an open society to keep yourself safe. You're not safer in the dark. You don't hide your vulnerabilities. You expose them and you fix them. That's how we proceed in America. The third point I just want to make about where we are today, we're in the middle of a syndrome that one senior government official I really respect, holds all the clearances, does the audits, pushes back against excessive secrecy. He called it WIKIMANIA. We're in the middle of WIKIMANIA. And it's going to lead to so much more heat than light. Targeted assassination is only the most extreme case. But look at all the other proposals we've got on the table on the front burners to try to push back, to punish WikiLeaks, to push back against speech. I think the problem here is we've got to look at each one of those proposals and say, is that really going to address the problem? Is it going to reduce government secrecy, or is it going to add to it? Is it going to make us more safe? Is it going to make us more free? And do that test. The WikiMania is really coming from a series of what in my statement I call wiki myths. There has not been a documents dump. Everybody uses that phrase. There hasn't been one. The less than 2,000 cables are on the public record today out of that big database. And the editors of Le Monde and The Guardian and New York Times say that WikiLeaks is consulting with them about what to publish, what to redact, and doing the dialogue with government officials in a pretty extraordinary, responsible way. It's a very different posture, I should say, than WikiLeaks had even 6 or 8 months ago. I think the criticism they've gotten from journalists like us and from the public about endangering people's lives in Afghanistan and elsewhere, believe it or not, I think they've actually heard it. There's no epidemic of leaks. In fact, all 4 of the big WikiLeaks publicity spats have come from a single person, as far as we know, Bradley Manning, young private. So how do you solve the Bradley Manning problem? Well, you could do a pretty simple thing. The Defense Department has already done it. And here's a rational security policy. Just like you got 2 people to launch nuclear missiles, you got 2 people to handle a communications manual that has codes in it. Have 2 people before you can download something from a secure network. Pretty simple. That would have stopped Bradley Manning, right? Mormons send out 2 people as missionaries because that's how you have accountability, right? You don't have solos. All right. There's no diplomatic meltdown from the WikiLeaks. I mean, there is a lot of heated rhetoric, but Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who ought to know, he served every president in my lifetime, as far as I can tell. And Mr. Chairman, you quoted his remarks. Yeah, it's awkward. Yeah, it's embarrassing. But no, it's not a meltdown. It's going to make a job harder for diplomats. Maybe somebody's going to have to be reassigned. But, you know, in the long run, it's probably in the American national security interest for more foreign governments to be more accountable to their own citizens for their diplomacy. It's probably in our national security interest for the King of Saudi Arabia to actually be on the public record a little more often, and for Chinese Politburo members to get exposed every now and then. That might be a long-term goal of what American national security diplomacy ought to be about. And finally, there's not a set of wiki terrorists. I've heard that phrase batted around. They're not terrorists. I got to tell you, I wish every terrorist group in the world would write the U.S. ambassador in their local town, you know, days or a week before they're about to launch something, and ask the ambassador, hey, would you help us, you know, make sure nobody innocent gets hurt? Would you really work with us? We'd be glad to talk to you. Now, I understand why the ambassador didn't believe him, because WikiLeaks said, oh, and by the way, we'll keep anything you say to us confidential. It's kind of hard to square with the previous statements of WikiLeaks, but I wish every terrorist group would get into partnerships with Le Monde and El País and The Guardian and the New York Times to assess what the damage might be, to redact their own documents, to put regulators on the bombs they drop. That would be a good thing. WikiLeaks is not terrorists. And so that brings me my final real point and recommendation to this committee and to the prosecutors across the river in Alexandria, which is restraint. I know you don't usually have witnesses come up here and say, hey, let's all go take a nap. But, you know, in sleep-deprived Washington, we could use a little more restraint. I would say leave the Espionage Act back in mothballs, where it is right now and should stay. And in fact, what we know from some Freedom of Information requests, there's still some classified documents from 1917 that will give the Espionage Act very good company. Don't mess with it. Leave it alone. Our fundamental test should come out of Justice Stewart's dicta in the Pentagon Papers case and some wonderful articles that Jack Goldsmith has actually written in the last couple of years, where he says, look, our problem is, you know, the fundamental cause of leaks is a sense of illegitimacy that's bred by excessive government secrecy. And how do you address that? You reduce the secrecy. How do you deal with the legitimacy problem? You make sure as few secrets as possible are actually held, and you protect those very strongly. So the test is, for all these proposals, legislative and otherwise, does it send a signal that will actually reduce government secrecy? Does it send a signal that we need maximum possible disclosure, in Stewart's phrase, to have a system that actually has credibility and can protect the real secrets and where we can protect ourselves? So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity to engage in this debate. I think that's a very important caveat to what Professor Stone was saying, that the government has a lot more power to regulate the employee than it does to regulate the media. And I would add overclassification, as does Gabriel Schoenfeld, to that, that if we can't deal with the overclassification and we can't really protect serious whistleblowing, then I think the government is not on such solid ground on coming down hard on its own employees and regulating them in that more severe way that Professor Stone says is constitutionally valid.
Mr. Nader.
You've got a couple of great assets at your disposal for the next session. There is a terrific review board called the Public Interest Declassification Board, headed by Marty Faga, former head of the National Reconnaissance Office. And it's a group of smart people who are looking exactly at these questions. How do you change it on the front end so you don't, because every single classification decision that a lowly bureaucrat makes generates a stream of cost to the taxpayers and to the efficient flow of information that goes on indefinitely until somebody like me asks for that document to get released. That's a terrible way to do business. It should be automatic after, you know, a certain sunset on every one of these secrets. You can call in those Public Interest Declass Board folks. They can give you some expertise. There's a wonderful little office called the Information Security Oversight Office. Those are the folks that audit the secrecy system. They're smart. The head of that office is the guy who coined the term Wikimania that I've been using today in my statement. Call them in and give them some more resources. I think they got 29 people to ride herd on this massive overclassified security system. They need some help. But they can guide you through how does the stamp get made. And the last thing I would ask, Mr. Chairman, we've done about 4 different postings that support the consensus on the committee of massive overclassification. Congressman Poe commented on it, agreed with Congressman Delahunt. Actually, it seems that they actually agreed on this. This is actually a piece of White House email that was declassified in a process 1 week apart. And the first time they cut out the middle, blacked it out. And the second time they cut out the top and the bottom. You slide them together, you got the whole thing. And the punchline is, it was the same reviewer, a senior reviewer with 35 years experience. Called him up, said, "What's up with that?" He said, "Oh, it must have been something in the paper about Egypt that week, but Libya this week." I mean, that's the level of subjectivity.
Exactly.
We've got about 5 or 6 web postings of these kinds of graphic illustrations of the overclassification problem that will help you get your arms around it, and I hope do something about it.
Who authorizes the leaks, by the way?
There's that famous quote from James Baker, the former Secretary of State under President George H.W. Bush. He said, "You know, the ship of state is a very unusual ship. It's the only one that leaks from the top." And I think Daniel Shore once commented when David Gergen was brought into the Bush White House, you know, Jim Baker was too busy leaking at the high level. He needs somebody to leak at the mid-level, right?
Well, you know, what I find ironic, of course, is the umbrage that some will take about some leaks. But I guess it's not their leaks. There are good leaks and bad leaks, I guess, is the bottom line.
Mr. Congressman, that wonderful example from Columbia University, I think the best answer to that came from a professor there named Gary Sick, who was a career Navy officer and served on the National Security Council staff under Presidents Ford, Carter, and Reagan. Professor Sick stood up at, I think, an open meeting at Columbia and said, if there's any student of international affairs who is not reading the WikiLeaks cables, then they should be thrown out of the profession, because this is essential information. The Air Force is doing this. This is silly. The Air Force is essentially restricting its own open source information gathering. The Library of Congress is stopping the WikiLeaks site. This is just silly. It's self-defeating. It's foolish. I'm sure it will end. It doesn't get us anywhere. And there's the larger question you're going to, and I think this is where the slippery slope that Mr. Schoenfeld was talking about, he thought the act should apply to foreigners. Well, I have to say, on our website, the National Security Archive, we published the transcripts of Mao Zedong's meetings with Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. That's top secret information in China. That would certainly be subject to their Espionage Act. So they get a right to come prosecute me on that basis? I'm sorry, I don't think so. I think we should look at limiting our own laws and trying to move to a different kind of standard about what transparency we can bring about in governments worldwide.